Welcome to Night Coffee Crime, where we uncover the dark and twisted tales that linger in the shadows of history. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling story from 1950s California, a case that will leave you questioning the fine line between love and obsession. Elizabeth Ma Duncan, better known as Ma Duncan, orchestrated one of the most shocking crimes of her time. Betrayal, manipulation, and murder. This is a story you won't forget. Elizabeth Ma Duncan was 58 years old in 1958, a year that would mark the beginning of a dark and tragic story. She lived with her son, Frank Duncan, in a modest apartment in Santa Barbara, California. Their relationship was far from ordinary. Frank, a young attorney, often found himself at odds with his controlling mother, who seemed unwilling to let go of her grip on his life. One day, an argument between them reached a breaking point. Frank told Elizabeth that she needed to move out, a decision that enraged her. In a dramatic response, Elizabeth took an overdose of sleeping pills, resulting in a medical emergency. She was rushed to Cottage Hospital, where her life was saved. Among the dedicated staff at the hospital was a compassionate nurse named Olga Duncan. Originally from Canada, Olga had moved to Santa Barbara to pursue her career. During Elizabeth's recovery, fate intervened. Frank met Olga, and after his mother was discharged from the hospital, the two began dating. This budding romance would ignite Elizabeth's insecurities and set the stage for one of the most infamous cases in California's history. Frank and Olga married on June 20, 1958, and soon after, they discovered that Olga was pregnant. For most couples, this would be a joyous milestone, but for Elizabeth Duncan, it marked the beginning of a relentless campaign against her new daughter-in-law. Elizabeth made it no secret that she disapproved of Olga, believing she wasn't good enough for Frank, who was building a promising career as a defense attorney. Her disdain went beyond passive-aggressive comments. Elizabeth actively harassed the couple, often calling Olga to belittle her, telling her she wasn't right for Frank. The couple's life in Santa Barbara became a nightmare. Elizabeth's interference was so disruptive that they were forced to move 3 times in an effort to escape her harassment. But no distance seemed to be enough. Elizabeth would telephone Olga almost daily for 3 months, attempting to wear her down emotionally. Frank, caught between his mother's obsessive demands and his commitment to Olga, tried to keep the peace in a deeply unusual arrangement. While he spent every evening with his wife in her apartment, he would return each night to the apartment he shared with his mother, an arrangement that only further fueled Elizabeth's hold on him. This tense dynamic set the stage for the unthinkable events that would follow. When harassment and threats failed to drive a wedge between Frank and Olga, Elizabeth Duncan's actions took a sinister turn. Her obsession with eliminating Olga reached a new level as she began actively seeking accomplices to carry out her deadly intentions. In mid-July 1958, Elizabeth approached a longtime acquaintance, Barbara Reed. Over the course of their conversation, Elizabeth shockingly proposed a grim solution, offering Barbara $1,500 to help her kill Olga. The offer was chilling in its brazenness, revealing just how far Elizabeth was willing to go to remove her perceived rival. Barbara initially feigned interest, stating she would think it over. However, she quickly realized the severity of the situation and took decisive action. Barbara informed Frank about his mother's proposal, likely hoping to end the dangerous path Elizabeth was headed down. This revelation placed Frank in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to his mother and protecting his wife. Yet even Barbara's warning wasn't enough to stop Elizabeth from spiraling deeper into her obsessive mission, setting the stage for an even darker turn of events. By August 1958, Elizabeth Duncan's desperation had reached a fever pitch. She devised an elaborate plan to dissolve Frank and Olga's marriage through fraudulent means, enlisting the help of Ralph Winterstein, an ex-convict. Elizabeth posed as Olga, while Winterstein pretended to be Frank. Together, they orchestrated a sham annulment hearing. During the brief, uncontested session, Winterstein testified as the plaintiff, claiming that Olga had refused to live with him since their marriage and that she had told him she had never intended to go through with the marriage. The court accepted this fabricated testimony and granted an annulment. Though the scheme temporarily succeeded, Elizabeth was not satisfied. Her obsession drove her to push Winterstein further. She later involved Mrs. Short, another associate, persuading her to propose to Winterstein that he take care of Olga, a chilling euphemism for murder. Winterstein refused the suggestion but chose to stay silent about the incident, fearing legal repercussions from his involvement in the fraudulent annulment. This sequence of events showcased Elizabeth's escalating determination to rid herself of Olga at any cost, further entrenching her in a dangerous and irreversible course of action. Elizabeth Duncan's schemes grew more sinister as she continued her relentless pursuit to eliminate Olga. She began weaving a web of lies, attempting to enlist anyone who might assist her. Elizabeth approached Diane Romero, whose husband Rudolph was one of Frank's clients. She falsely claimed that Olga was blackmailing Frank and asked Diane to help her get rid of Olga. When Diane's husband, Rudolph, was approached with a monetary offer to carry out the act, he flatly refused. Undeterred, Elizabeth turned to Rebecca Diaz, the Romeros' landlord. She spun another false story, alleging that Olga was threatening her and demanding money. Elizabeth asked Rebecca to help find someone who could get Olga out of town. Rebecca initially agreed to contact Elizabeth if she found anyone willing to assist. Eventually, Elizabeth connected with two men, Luis Moya and Agustin Baldonado. Their involvement marked a critical turning point in her plans. After meeting them, Elizabeth called Rebecca Diaz with a chilling message: "Well, forget about it. I won't need you anymore. It will be today or never." This ominous statement foreshadowed the dark actions that were soon to unfold, solidifying Elizabeth's descent into a path of no return. On November 12, 1958, Elizabeth Duncan took another step in her relentless campaign. Accompanied by Mrs. Short, she visited the Tropical Café in Santa Barbara. The café was owned by Esperanza Esquivel, whose husband had been one of Frank Duncan's clients. Frank had successfully defended Mrs. Esquivel and obtained a dismissal for her, while negotiating for probation for her husband, who had pleaded guilty to charges of receiving stolen property. Elizabeth, using her knowledge of the Esquivel family connection, approached Mrs. Esquivel with a twisted narrative. She claimed Olga was blackmailing her and threatened to throw acid in Frank's face. Elizabeth then asked Mrs. Esquivel if she knew anyone who could help get rid of Olga. Mrs. Esquivel responded cautiously, mentioning that she did know some young men who might be willing to help. However, she made it clear that she was unsure whether they would be interested in talking to Elizabeth. This interaction underscored Elizabeth's desperation, as she turned to an increasingly wider network, hoping that someone would fulfill her dark request. But with each attempt, the lines between persuasion, manipulation, and coercion blurred even further. The following day, Elizabeth Duncan, accompanied by Mrs. Short, returned to the Tropical Café. This time, she was introduced to two men, Moya and Baldonado, by Mrs. Esquivel. Elizabeth wasted no time in explaining her motives, claiming that her son, Frank, was being blackmailed by Olga and that she wanted to get rid of her. The conversation quickly turned to finances and logistics. The men agreed to take on the job for $3,000, with an additional $3,000 promised to be paid within 3 to 6 months after the completion of their task. Various plans were considered before a scheme was settled upon. Moya and Baldonado would kidnap Olga, transport her across the border, and kill her in Tijuana. Moya made it clear that the operation would require funding for transportation, a weapon, and gloves. Elizabeth, now fully committed to the plan, left for a short while. When she returned, she went to the kitchen with Moya and handed him $175. This money had been secured by pawning some of her rings. The plot was in motion, and Elizabeth was prepared to go to any lengths to carry out her plan. On the evening of November 17, 1958, the plan was set into motion. Moya and Baldonado drove to Olga's apartment. When Olga answered the door, Moya claimed that her husband was in the car, drunk, and urgently needed her help. Trusting the situation, Olga followed Moya out to the car, where Baldonado waited in the back seat, pretending to be Frank. As Olga opened the rear door, Moya struck her with the pistol on the back of her head. Baldonado then pulled her into the car. They left Santa Barbara, taking a route toward the outskirts of the city. They drove to a secluded spot on the beach, where they stopped because Olga was screaming and struggling. In response, Baldonado restrained her while Moya, now wielding the broken handle of the gun, struck her once more, knocking her unconscious for good. Afterward, Baldonado used tape to bind her before they continued their journey out of town, with Olga's fate sealed. Shortly after leaving Santa Barbara, they encountered trouble with their car. Faced with the failure of their original plan to cross into Mexico, they veered off into the rugged mountains near Ojai, Ventura County. In the cold, dark wilderness, Moya and Baldonado forcibly pulled Olga out of the car and dragged her down a steep hillside to a culvert that ran beneath the road. The pistol, now damaged beyond use, had failed to serve its original purpose. With no other means, the men took turns strangling Olga. As time passed, they felt her pulse cease, confirming that she was no longer alive. In a grim, silent decision, they dug a shallow grave and buried her there, leaving behind the scene of the crime and the silence of the night. After the grim task was completed, Moya contacted Elizabeth by phone to inform her that they had carried out their part of the deal. Elizabeth, anxious and wary of the increasing police attention surrounding Olga's disappearance, admitted that she was unable to withdraw money from the bank due to the inquiries. Undeterred, she managed to cash a check that Frank had given her for a typewriter purchase. With the money in hand, she arranged to meet Moya at a downtown store in Santa Barbara. There, she discreetly handed him an envelope containing $150 as part of the payment they had agreed upon. The transactions did not stop there. Later, at Elizabeth's request, Mrs. Short left another envelope for Moya at a local restaurant. This envelope, addressed to Dorothy, contained $10. Moya, having been instructed on how to retrieve it, claimed it was for his aunt, successfully collecting the money without raising suspicion. During the period in which Elizabeth continued making payments to Moya and Baldonado, her son Frank grew suspicious. When he questioned her about the check she had cashed to pay for a typewriter, she confessed that she was being blackmailed. This revelation prompted Frank to inform the police, expressing his concerns that his mother might be involved in Olga's disappearance and that she was being blackmailed in connection with it. The investigation that followed soon unraveled the truth. Both Moya and Baldonado were questioned and, under the pressure of their confessions, admitted to the killing of Olga Duncan. In their statements, they disclosed that Elizabeth had hired them to carry out the murder, detailing the grim sequence of events and how they were paid for their part in the crime. The evidence that linked Elizabeth to the murder was irrefutable, leading to her arrest on charges of murder. On December 21, Olga's body was disinterred, and an autopsy was conducted. The medical examination revealed a tragic truth: Olga had been pregnant at the time of her death. The cause of death was determined to be head injuries, strangulation, or suffocation, potentially consistent with being buried alive, further underscoring the horror of her final moments. In her defense, Elizabeth took the stand, denying any involvement in the crime. She refuted the accusations and claimed that she had not made any of the solicitations as testified by the prosecution witnesses. The courtroom echoed with the weight of the evidence and the stark denial, setting the stage for the ongoing proceedings. Frank Duncan's testimony in his mother's trial was a significant turning point. As a defense witness, he defended his mother's innocence and worked closely with her attorney to build her case. Despite his efforts, Ma Duncan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Moya and Baldonado, the men who had carried out the killing, had already confessed and were sentenced to death before the trial of Ma Duncan. Their confessions played a key role in the prosecution's case against her. While Ma Duncan sat in prison awaiting her fate, Frank's life took a different path. He remarried, this time to an attorney, though this marriage ended in divorce years later. On August 8, 1962, Ma Duncan was executed, making her the last woman to be executed in California. Frank Duncan, who had witnessed his mother's downfall and the events that followed, eventually carved out a successful career for himself as a defense attorney in Los Angeles. Despite the shadow cast by his mother's crime, he found professional success in the legal field after everything had passed. True crime often forces us to confront the darkest corners of human behavior. The story of Ma Duncan and the tragic murder of Olga Duncan is a haunting example of betrayal, desperation, and manipulation leading to devastating consequences. While Ma Duncan's actions were driven by her own motives, we cannot forget the innocent life lost, Olga's, a woman whose future was cut short by violence. Thank you for joining us as we explored one of California's most infamous cases. If you found this story thought-provoking, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more stories from Night Coffee Crime. Until next time, stay safe and take care.